As Tony was reminding us about Larry Keyes and his ministry, which has been going on for a number of years, part of which is to bring people technology and help them be more productive with what they have. But early on in the missionaries, of course, always brought in new technology, and I ran into the story that one of the earlier missionaries had set up a generator in his, brought a little generator along that he could run so he could have a little electric light in the middle of his room, and he'd have this light in his room, and when some of the native folks came to visit with him, he'd go over and flip his switch and his light would come on. Nothing unusual to us, but to people who had never seen electricity, they were quite impressed by that. And they thought, wow, that's really pretty amazing. And so one of the chiefs asked him if he could have one of the light bulbs. He said, well, sure, you can have one. He wasn't real sure what he wanted to do with it, but he gave him a light bulb. And then the next time he went to visit him at his home, and as he went in there, he looked up, and there hanging from a string was the light bulb. But it was just hanging from a string. And so he explained to him, and I guess you'd call that one of those great opportunities of learning, the light bulb is not where the source of the energy comes from. And of course, that's a nice symbol to remind us that we often get confused with seeing something like a symbol or something, or even the process of the label of being a Christian or a disciple. But we have to remember that our faith is only really going to be able to continue to give out light if we're connected to the source. We have to connect to the source of where the light comes from, or the light won't come on. It's just an empty bulb, an empty symbol of something, unless we connect to the source. Of course, that's also our reminder as we connect to prayer time in our Trying a New Course, or any time that we're in prayer, this encouragement that we need to be connected to God. We need to have God as our connection. And as the epistle points out to us, that one of the ways of understanding abiding in God, one of the strong ways we talk about that, is in love. How we act in love says a lot about how we connect. Now, this light bulb's idea connected to the board in some ways probably connects more to us as well in our world than we're probably able to understand that symbolism of being connected to the electricity maybe better than we are about being connected to the vine, because very few of us probably have grape or vineyards. Some of us do gardening. We put our geraniums in, so we understand this imagery of the plant, but we're not so much an agricultural society that understands that. There was a book out a few years ago called In the Secret of Vines, and he was writing about this interesting thing about when new growth happens in a vineyard on a vine, that the plant will often, the new vines will grow out on the ground. And if they're laying in the dirt, they get dirty, of course, and the rain splatters on them, and they get mildewy, and they're not healthy enough really to produce fruit. They're wasted space. I actually had that happen to me last year. I planted tomatoes and I didn't do a good fence job, so they fell over. And not only didn't they produce any fruit, but they killed the grass they were laying on. So I understand how important it is to get them up. Now, this vineyard person was asked, he said, well then, so what do? Just cut off all those extra? He said, no, you don't want to cut them off. They can produce fruit, but you have to go out into the field with a bucket of water and you wash each of them off, and then you tie it up. So you clean and lift. And then they can produce fruits, but they can't just lay there in the dirt and be left alone. They need help, they need support, they need to be lifted up. By being cleaned and lifted up, it's possible to create a new fruit. So that also is kind of a neat image of the church, that need to remind ourselves that when we connect with those who are broken and down, we're not to cut them off, we're not to criticize. It's not about judgment. It's about finding a way to clean. Of course, you get the image of baptism, and clean and lift. Now, the John passage does talk about pruning, and I think it's interesting that we often look at that, if we're in a judgmental mode anyway, we look at that and think about people who need to be cut off. But I think the pruning is much more helpful. It's much more helpful if you look within, because indeed there are things within us that stop us from being productive in terms of God's purpose. There are things that get us connected to worldly concerns or self-concerns that need to be cut off. They need to be eliminated. And so I think you need to look at that understanding when you're looking at pruning. What within me stops me from really believing in what I can do for God? What within it limits me? There was a few years ago, there was a movie out called Galaxy Quest. Anybody remember that? It's not a very famous movie. But it kind of gets at this idea of the Star Trek thing, and it's about these actors their TV show has ended, and it was like Star Trek. And now they make their living going to these conventions. Now, I have to confess personally that it's always sort of amazed me as a society how we lift up actors. We lift up people pretending to be somebody else. And somehow that's sometimes our most famous people and even our youth. I want to be like that person. And you go, well, they don't really exist. They're just an actor. They're pretending to be somebody else. Well, what happens in Galaxy Quest is you find these very shallow actors who are, of course, very much each into their own ego, and as they recall the old TV show that they used to have, they all remember that they were really the primary character. They were the one that held it all together. And so we don't find people that are very good models for what we would like to do, and they're certainly not producing any fruit with their lives. Well, in the movie, now this probably never happened in real life, but in the movie they're actually captured by aliens. And these aliens have based their whole society on this TV show. Somewhere off in the distance they picked up this TV show and they produced their whole culture around this TV show, including creating a ship. And so when the actors got on the ship, if they went through the role of pretending to be themselves that they used to be, the machines all worked on the ship. And they were forced to become what they had acted. When they believed in themselves and took on the role of really being the captain, really doing what was necessary because these other people believed in them, what others had faith in them, when they acted on it, they actually became something more than actors. They became the real people. They heard the belief, they developed the belief, they set aside their ego and became what they were called to become, which was more than what they had been. Now, it's a comedy, of course, but it's an interesting illustration. If someone believes in us and we begin to act on that belief, if God believes in what we can do and we begin to act in that belief, we can become more than just actors or pretending to be. We actually develop faith. Actually, John Wesley, as he was trying to develop his faith life, was told by Moravians, ooh, that wasn't really where I wanted the accent. Was told by Moravians that if he didn't have faith, to pray until he did have faith. And he did, and that came truth for him. But we need to act on our beliefs. It needs to be more than something we just keep to ourselves. There's a great little story about a pastor who was greeting people at the end of church services, we often do. And a guy came out, and the pastor had never seen him before. And he shook his hand and said, I've been a great follower of you, and I've been a really active Christian all my life, and I just appreciated your sermon this morning. It just really helps me with my work. And he said, you mean in this area? I said, yeah, I've always lived here my whole life. He said, well, I've never seen you before. He said, well, I'm in Jesus' secret service. Well, I know none of you are because you're here. You're not in the secret service. But sometimes we forget about being a faithful member is not something we keep secret. It's being part of God's disciples is not something we're supposed to keep secret. It's something we act on and develop in our lives. This charting the new course is about connecting. Our first goal in this is really to get us connect back to the source. Connect back in prayer. Connect back to God. So we are called first to connect to the source. That's a big piece of what we're talking about in charting a new course. Then, in that process, like the Galaxy Quest, we need to believe our message. We need to believe it in a deep felt way that is who we are as a people, as a community. And then we need to act, create fruit, develop fruit. Fruit means feed those who come into our context, even as we feed ourselves. So, connect to the source, believe in the faith, and act on that faith.